Well, welcome back again to another episode of the ResearchWorks podcast. I'm back onto hosting duties as our fabulous Dr. Ashley Thornton is on maternity leave, having just given birth. Welcome back, Marissa Smith.
Excited to be here. Yeah. Thanks for having me again.
It's lovely to have you here.
And what a podcast we have lined up for today. We have the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Alexandra Sullivan.
Oh, how fabulous is that? Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful, wonderful to have you here today. And look, this is another time zone for us to navigate. That's always, I mean, we all turned up at the same time, which is always fabulous. And look, I took great interest when I read your paper because it's something that we haven't really spoken about before, but the importance of it, we could just see how significant it would be. And it's just a beautiful study. So today, for all of our listeners, we're talking about a paper that was published in Psychological Science in 2023, and it's titled Parenting Practices May Buffer the Impact of Adversity on Epigenetic Age Acceleration Among Young Children with Developmental Delays.
It's a very interesting topic,
right?
That's for sure.
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions that come from this, which is what the purpose of today is. But before we get into it, I think we should tell everyone a bit more about you, Alexandra, and your background. So Dr. Alexandra Sullivan is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, San Francisco, conducting interdisciplinary research on the biological embedding of stress and how positive parenting can protect children from the physical and psychiatric problems associated with early life and intergenerational adversity exposure. Dr. Sullivan earned her PhD in clinical and developmental psychology from the University of Vermont and completed her clinical internship at the Medical University of South Carolina. Her novel work combines psychosocial, parent-child interventions and child biomarkers reflective of transdiagnostic health outcomes. Her program of research has received recognitions from organisations, including the APA Division 53 Student Research Award and the American Psychosomatic Society Young Investigator Award.
Oh, it's pretty impressive. Congratulations on all of that. And to be at the same time just receiving recognition for the work that you do, that must be an absolute thrill whilst doing something you love, hey?
Yes, certainly.
It's so very cool. But before we get into it, Marissa, the duties are over to you.
Yes, and now we're just going to take a different side and then we're going to come back. So the icebreaker question for today is an interesting one. If you could be immortal, what age would you choose to stop aging at and why?
That's a deep question.
I'm still thinking, I keep changing.
Let's go guess first. Are you ready for this question?
Yes, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I read a lot of fantasy fiction, so there's a lot of immortality represented.
Love it. Kindred spirit. I love it.
And so honestly, thinking about this, as I am like feeling a little achy from a bike ride that was a little too long on Sunday, I think I would choose a couple years older than I am now. And I have a couple of reasons.
Okay.
Reason number one is I can still retain muscle mass from my understanding of physiology and being a woman, and it's very important to me. And reason number two is while I do love being a postdoc, I'm really looking forward to, and I'm starting to explore being able to be an assistant professor, and I'm optimistic and hope at 34, which is a couple years out for me, I will be situated in one of those positions.
Yeah, that's cool. I love that there's a nice personal element to it and a career perspective as well. It's an exciting phase, actually. I love that.
It really, it's both exciting and it's a little bit like adolescence in that there's some awkwardness, and I'm trying to, do my program of research and also maintain that learner trainee perspective as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful phase because there's no expectation that you've arrived in any way, because you're just learning, you're curious, and you want to maintain that. I love it. Well, you've thought really deeply about.
I love how you put muscle mass into it and about your body. Now that just throws everything.
So I lift so I know that it's really hard. I mean, you guys, I'm sure, understand this better than I do. To women drop their muscles, right?
That's
we gotta keep it.
It's significant for us and very important. Okay, I love that you thought about that.
Dana.
Me, okay, so I would say if I could, so it's a little bit younger now, so I've passed this age. So by experience, I think if I could stay 38,
yes,
I'd be thrilled. I'm 4 years past that now. And the reasons I came about that was also kind of related to muscle. I still think I've got good muscle mass, but my metabolism has definitely dropped off. I have to work so much harder. I think I still eat the same amount, but I work so much harder. It's just trickier. And so I think that will be a big part because I love food.
Yes.
And so now I've got to go, man, I've got to work a little bit harder if I want to maintain the same intake. And for me, 38 as well was just a prime time of just, I don't know, you know who you are, you're more sure of who you are, you don't have to worry so much about, being someone else. You're just confidently you, and it takes some time to be confident who that was. And for me, it took me till probably about that age to really go, yeah, this is me, and I'm happy in my skin.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But metabolism was definitely really more spot on at 38.
Well, I'm turning 38 this year, so watch out. Okay. Look, I'm going to go a bit different. I was thinking like also similar things, but then I also thought, to be a child again, the innocence of a child. And I watch my kids sometimes, they don't have any smartphones, they don't have any, I've got to be somewhere. Their simple, big, important things are things like, my child was to ice biscuits for a bake store today. Like that was the biggest thing on her agenda. And obviously I love where I'm at and I'm super grateful for all the things that come about in our career. But I think it's the innocence and pure joy of being a kid sometimes. And I think, and even just being in that moment, embracing it, I guess it's something we should carry through to all our different ages. But yeah, there's some innocence there.
I like that. Okay, so I want to be 38 with a childlike perspective as well.
That's it.
Yeah,
yes.
maybe that's what I want. With my muscle mass and my metabolism.
And maybe like healing ability.
Yeah.
To bounce back from injuries.
That would be so great. Just keep that collagen going, man. Oh my goodness. Yeah, you definitely feel it. Getting off the floor is a lot harder.
We have really overthought this question, all of us.
Well, let's get into this because really, I feel like we're talking about aging today and I have so much to learn. So let's give everyone a bit of a rundown about what we'll be talking about today. So this randomised controlled trial of a telehealth-based behavioural parenting intervention aimed to evaluate whether increases in positive parenting such as praise, engagement and warmth, and decreases in negative parenting, so criticism and hostility, buffer the impact of adversity exposure on epigenetic age acceleration among minority preschoolers with developmental delays. So this research found that children exposed to more adversity showed lower epigenetic age acceleration when their parents engaged in increased positive and decreased negative parenting practices. This suggests that improved parenting can act as a buffer against the effects of adversity on biological aging in young children.
It's incredible. I love all the pull home and the take home messages from your paper.
Yeah.
But for our listeners and even for us too, I have more questions about some of the foundational things.
Yes.
So we can understand some of the I guess definitions and key themes within your study. So can you start off by telling me a bit about what do we mean by accelerated biological aging?
Of course, and that's the first question that everyone has.
Good.
Good. Okay.
So accelerated biological aging is this construct that we're seeing more and more in research as a way of operationalizing how fast our bodies seem to be aging relative to how old we are if we, subtracted today's date and calculate it from our birth date. So accelerated biological aging is a situation when your cells, your biology, and in this case, your epigenome, seems to reflect that of somebody who is older than what your actual today's date and the difference between today's date and your birth date is. Would it be helpful for me to talk a little bit about what we mean by epigenetic age?
That was our next question. Yeah.
Okay, so there's this overall construct of accelerated biological aging, which was really easy to talk to other folks about. But then, of course, we're scientists, so there's the specific quantification of it. The epigenetic aging algorithm, it's called the epigenetic clock, and there are a few different clocks. I'm going to try and be concise here because I can talk a little bit too much about it. So it uses markers on your DNA at different sites on your DNA to get a sense of how old you are. And it does this by as you're going about your day to day, your DNA, like the foundational DNA in your cells, doesn't change, but social experiences can change your epigenome. So it can change how much different parts of your epigenome on top of your genome are methylated. And that methylation is related, you can kind of think about it like a dimmer switch. So I want everyone to envision like that DNA strand, like the double helix is swirling. And we have different parts of that strand have these little tags on top, which is these methyl groups, DNA methylation. And the different levels of DNA methylation either turn on, turn off, or somewhere in between genes. So it's related to what part of your DNA, your genes are expressed.
Okay.
The clock uses all this information in a big machine learning algorithm. Have you guys encountered that at all yet in your talks?
Machine learning algorithms. We've done a lot of that, but not in this area. But yes, but maybe go through it. Yeah.
They train using artificial intelligence these mathematical equations on giant sets of representative populations to basically come up with an algorithm that uses these methylation levels to correlates it with people's age. And what this algorithm scientists and this algorithm figured out is that there are certain sites on your epigenome that correlate really closely with how old you are.
Wow.
When they did this research in big populations.
Right.
So like it's kind of reliable.
Yes.
And it seems to suggest how old folks are. But it's not 100%, and that variability in how tightly things are correlated seems to reflect health outcomes.
Wow.
So if you are somebody, if again, this is research, right? So we're talking about populations and averages.
Yes.
But if folks are showing average epigenetic ages as they determined by this cool methylation algorithm, if that's faster than what their chronological age is, how old they are, that these individuals are more likely to have certain health problems down the road. And also very importantly, they are more likely to have been exposed to stress.
Right. Okay. So how you described that reminds me of, and I don't want to pull it down to this silly TV show that I watched a little while ago, and it was a UK show, and they're like, your biological age is 35, and they do some tests and go, but your actual age, what it's looking like on this DNA test, is like 65. So and they were sort of talking about how unhealthy and unfit they were, and how that was sort of accelerating their growth, that they're aging. I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it's it's the exposure. Like from my perspective, when we're talking about our sort of, mythical immortality age kind of thing, you could be a certain age, but your body could actually show greater signs of stress. And so you got greater risk that will be comparable to that higher age, for example. It's kind of like that.
Right, and social drivers of health track it too, right? So, we find individuals of like being exposed to more stress, they'll be having lower incomes, dealing with more trauma exposure. All of these things seem to forecast an individual with, or populations with more accelerated aging. And like the thing that you mentioned, Dana, with that, is Dana, right?
Yeah.
Dana and Marissa, awesome. Thank you. The thing that you mentioned with that individual score, like, I'm not convinced the science is there just yet, right? That we can take one person's swab of their cheek. I mean, we're trying to get there, but like that is kind of the goal, right? To have it be diagnostic and helpful.
And it's interesting how you described it in terms of the psychological aspects and how social determinants would be related to that. I guess just with what you've just said there, why else would we would be worried about accelerated biological aging? Like what are the biggest things there? I think we've talked generally about some health adversity and things like that, but why are we really worried about this?
Because people with, accelerated biological age seems to forecast early morbidity and mortality.
Wow.
So people with more accelerated aging seem, at least at population levels, we see those people with more health problems, cardiometabolic health problems, and earlier death.
Wow. This really is.
And so we're talking about the adult research right now. This is a very new research area. The research I do is explicitly with kids.
Yeah.
And that's also a little complicated, right? What does accelerated aging mean for a 4-year-old?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be good? Don't we want advanced?
That's what I was trying to work out, because I was like, obviously there's a developmental component in terms of what they're achieving in terms of milestones for gross motor or fine motor or language. So I was trying to get my head around that. But obviously you're looking at the impact of stress and how their body is physiologically aging.
Exactly. So that's what I like. I mean, the way that it's helpful for me to think about, and when I was talking to my husband about it, he's like, "Oh, wouldn't you want to? Wouldn't it be adaptive? Wouldn't it be helpful?"
Yeah.
And like, yes, right.
Yeah.
So another thing we notice in kids exposed to stress, they're more hypervigilant for anger cues. They're better at picking up when people are angry around them. That can be kind of problematic down the road, right? Like, you don't want to be a person who's always on the lookout, but if you're growing up in a pretty stressful situation that maybe has a lot of fighting or potential violence, that's really helpful. It helps keep you safe. It's the same thing with this accelerated aging. Bodies are moving a little bit more quickly to likely cope with the increasing demands of a stressful environment. However, you kind of have to pay, like, there's some cost associated with that acceleration, and with that's where we think we see this increased health problem down the road.
Right. So you've mentioned there in terms of what the household might be like. What are some other examples of some adverse childhood experiences that we're particularly interested in here?
Yes. Have y'all talked much about ACEs just yet? Adverse childhood experiences?
No.
Okay, so ACEs, especially in the U.S. and in California, where I'm situated, is a big policy initiative. It's like a list of a certain number of childhood stressors that you count up. And you see how many each kid is exposed to, and we know that the more kids are exposed to, that's a screener flag that they're going to need a little more support.
Wow.
Some examples of these are parental psychopathology, like when a parent is struggling with mental health problems. That can be difficult for our family system. Divorce is one of them. That's really common, but it's still, especially if you think about it cumulatively, in this context where a parent maybe uses substances or another parent is struggling with depression, all those things together can really add to the amount of stress a family system is coping with.
Wow. Yeah, no, that makes a whole lot of sense, doesn't it?
It's very interesting, but very sad.
It is.
But then you can put things in place, which is where we go to with your study. So I think you've set a great...
It does have... Right.
A lot of implications. Yeah, absolutely.
You set a great foundation and already answered some of my questions, which is great. There is more to come, though. So now we'll jump into your study. Can you tell us more about what was the objective of your study? What were you setting out to look into?
So I had a couple objectives. Objective number one, which ended up being a null effect, and I want to be very transparent about what we found in the study, was to see if there was just an intervention level effect, right? If we give kids this evidence-based parenting intervention, we know that this evidence-based parenting intervention really supports attachment and enhances attachment quality, improves relationships between parents and kids. That might help kids regulate, cope with stress better, and then we might see it trickle down into their physical bodies. And so might we see an overall intervention level main effect of lower epigenetic age acceleration in the kids who got the intervention. And we didn't. That was null. But if you look at the numbers, they're moving in the right direction. It's a small sample size. Stay tuned. We're doing more research now with a larger sample, so I'm hopeful we'll see some more findings. But the other thing that I really wanted to look at is, because of that small sample, we did some fancy stats that allows us to better understand what's going on in the small sample. And I wanted to see if kind of this mechanism of change that is attributable to the intervention, parenting behaviors, if those parenting behaviors actually might have a protective effect, an ameliorating effect on exposure to stress, and how that relates to kids' accelerated biological aging.
Well, that's really interesting already in terms of the two big objectives, which we're going to delve into a little bit more. Before we get into more of that, though, in terms of who was actually included in your study. So you said it was a smaller sample size, but who was the main target population here?
So this was my dissertation study. So we need to recall that budgetary constraints were part of the deal. And so what happened is some really wonderful coworkers at Florida International University were kind and shared their large sample with me. So they were doing a big trial on whether telehealth-based parenting intervention, a specific one called parent-child interaction therapy, whether that supported reduced behavioral problems and improved parenting in kids with developmental delay. And they allowed us to contact their families to see if they wanted to participate in a sub-study, the DNA sub-study, the one in which we took saliva samples to get the epigenetic information from kids. And so we ended up with 62 kids from this overall 150-person trial who gave us their saliva samples.
Yeah, and they were all preschoolers, weren't they? That was the main
target.
They're
exactly 3 years old if you the mean and standard deviation, because they were aging out of a public out of like a health service that children received in Florida. There was a service gap for these kids, and part of the intention of this is called the parent study. The overall study was to fill that service gap and see if this internet-based parent training intervention might help kind of bridge those kids until they aged into the next publicly provided services. As we know, healthcare in America is not as comprehensive or thorough as we wish it were.
Sure.
Can you tell us more about the preschoolers and a bit more about their inclusion criteria for them to be in the study?
Yes. Of course. So these were preschoolers. They're located in Florida, and they're located in a expensive urban area. And the majority of these kids end up being Latinx kiddos, and most of them were very low income, as they weren't recruited for that intention, but rather that ended up being what happens when you look for children who express developmental delays and are experiencing the service gap. These groups are overrepresented. And 50% of them spoke Spanish, so half of our interventionists were able to offer the treatment in Spanish. And let's see, and I think the other thing that I want to articulate is that they did report relatively high exposure to stress. So when you look across all these different families, these children were definitely coping with a variety of family stressors, like parents reporting elevated levels of depression or poverty, or parents reported elevated levels of anxiety, those kinds of things.
Well, then I guess from there, I'm really curious then with regards to your outcome measures. You've got obviously as part of this larger study, and this was very specific for you, which is the DNA. But can you talk us through a little bit more about how you collected this and as part of your main outcome measure?
Like how you collect the actual, it's really cool. And it's getting easier and cheaper. So if people so let me collect my thoughts for a second because I can get excited. So we are able to take saliva samples. Ideally, you'd take buccal swabs, cheek swabs, but we took saliva samples in this situation. And what the kids essentially will drool into a tube. I'm sure we're familiar with some of these procedures. And then this sample goes to a lab where they use a very expensive and cool machine that allows us to determine the different percentages of methylation across all these different sites on the epigenome.
Right.
And that's kind of the saliva samples are relatively cheap and easy these days to collect. Running the procedures through this epic array is what it's called to get the methylation levels can be really expensive.
Wow.
Once you get that, there are these open source codes for well-validated algorithms for the epigenetic clocks. We use the pediatric buccal epigenetic clock, which is currently the one that is trained on samples of children, something that's really important. A lot of studies out there, it's a relatively new clock for kids.
Sure.
Some of the studies with kids have used adult clocks, but they weren't trained on samples of children. Your algorithms is only as good as the data you train it on.
That's right. Well, we've been doing a little bit of stuff on machine learning. I feel like I can understand that a bit more because it is so important to have the good data set and have a well-trained algorithm. That's actually the whole crux of it, I suppose, isn't it? It's really important.
You can't make an inference if it's not like a diverse sample. And of course there are critiques of every clock, but the pediatric focal clock is really, I ended up, the postdoc position I'm working in now after my dissertation is with I've been able to work closely with the actual makers of this clock.
Oh,
so
wow.
that's been amazing.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's so great.
What other outcome measures did you use? Obviously, there was the saliva samples and working out the epigenetic age. But what other outcome measures did you use to, I guess, assess parenting behaviours and family impact?
So our outcome was, I would say we only had that one outcome, which was the epigenetic clock. But we had a couple different exposures that we were looking at.
Okay.
And I'm wiggling so much. We were looking at cumulative risk. So the degree to which individuals were exposed to stress.
Yeah.
So that was assessed with, there's a wide battery of measures that the parents filled out. And I calculated this cumulative risk measure looking for clinically indicated exposures that I know are associated with health problems. Okay. So there are many different ones, but we ended up with like single parent status, low income, clinically significant parent depression, or to name a few.
Yeah.
The other measure, which is crucial and I'm really excited about, is we got observations of parenting.
Right.
I'm trying not to bore you with methods details too much, but it's really, parents, when they self-report on their parenting, tend to be a little biased.
Yeah, sure.
You know? Right? Like when we self-report on any health behavior, oh yeah, I drink a lot of water and eat a lot of vegetables, and I am an excellent parent. And they are all really strong, well-intentioned parents, but self-reports are pretty limited. We actually see huge ceiling effects, like no variability. It's really hard to. So we got observations where these parents and children are doing the standardized play task.
Yeah.
The kid's supposed to lead. I've done this intervention as a clinician before, and it is part of the intervention kind of testing out procedure is to observe these tasks.
Yeah.
And the parent and the kid are basically supposed to play for 5 minutes. The kid is supposed to lead, and this observation task then it's recorded and it's coded objectively by trained behavioral coders. So that's what we do a lot in psychological research if we're trying to get an objective measure of some kind of dyadic interaction.
Sure.
And the coders are tallying how much praise the parents are using. They're tallying how many specific descriptors they're using, how much they're tuned into your kid. And they're also, that's that positive parenting measure. To get at negative parenting, they're looking at criticisms. They're looking at how many questions their parents asking, because when we're dealing with 3-year-olds, we want to be keeping things a little more concise and directed for them.
Yeah.
So that really lets us, the way that I think about it, really gives us a nice signal of what parenting really might look at. And the task is structured, but it really emulates what parents and kids are hopefully doing in their day to day.
No, that's really interesting, and I love that it's such a robust method, really, and to be able to look at what that means now in the grand scheme of things. With the intervention, do you mind just going through what the intervention was? Because I was really interested in the fact that it was a telehealth intervention, which seems to be something that we've been talking about more of lately, which has been great because of access. There's challenges, there's advantages, of course, with that. But talk us through what that actually looked like and how that worked.
And especially with the timing of the study, the study was happening. I think all data were fortunately collected right before COVID got to really affect our clinic practices. But it was very timely to have telehealth intervention in this era. Yeah. And so this is called parent-child interaction therapy, which you can look up. It is an evidence-based intervention for, originally people tried to use it for behavioral problems. So when kids are evidencing high levels of behavior problems, pediatricians might refer families to get parent-child interaction therapy.
Okay.
The goal of parent-child interaction therapy is to increase reinforcing kids' positive behaviors and to decrease reinforcing problematic behaviors.
Okay.
And we do this by live coaching parents.
Wow.
So if I were watching you guys, I'd be like, Dana, you are sitting so quietly and calmly. You're paying such good attention. Thank you. So I'd be really trying to, right? And that's good.
Yeah.
And I am, as a clinician, I'm trying to urge the parent to notice those things in their kids. And then perhaps the hardest skill is to urge them to, it's called active ignoring.
Sure.
And I heard you guys mention having kids or pets or any creature that needs your attention. When they're doing something minor that you need to ignore, it is so hard.
I'm so bad at that, and it's almost like they know that that's frustrating.
Well, that's because they do. They know. Well, that's the purpose of the behavior, right? It's to get a response out of you.
And I'm the parent. I'm trying to tell myself it's something minor. Let it go, but you can't.
No, and more and more parenting interventions are starting to integrate strategies to really help parents regulate, because actively ignoring behaviors is really stinking hard.
It is.
Yeah.
And so one of my jobs as a clinician is, especially if a kid's like screaming, right? Because here's the thing, punishing a kid for like yelling is like enacting a discipline tactic is not really the most helpful.
Yeah.
This is the behavior that you can extinguish through behavioral practices. I mean, let's contextualize it. There's a lot of things that make this incredibly challenging. But if we can help parents kind of stay the course and ignore screaming, eventually kids learn that does not elicit the attention they want, and they move on to other tactics.
It makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. It's just like you said, it's then teaching the parent that and how, and then maintaining
really
that in the moment. But it's definitely important.
And that's the beauty of the coaching, right? And that is why I love telehealth, because we are not in a lab. We're in their living room.
Yes.
And one of the things I was on internship, my clinical, it's kind of like residency, where I was finishing my training as a clinician. And I was doing a lot of this work with kids in South Carolina, and like sometimes like what would happen is there would be like a sibling who would run into the room and like need mom's attention, and we would just roll with it, and we would practice, okay, mom, how can you use your attention as your superpower for both of your kids while they're in the room. So this telehealth, certainly the PCIT intervention for the study is pretty standardized, but the frame of telehealth is so, the word I like to use, ecologically valid. It just really lets you practice as you would want.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so I have lots of questions on that, because I feel like the positive praise, encouragement comes, it sounds more obvious, you know, when you see something great, you want to be able to give that praise. The negative one, I feel like, has evolved so much in terms of there's different experiences and different generations of what we experience. So it wasn't unusual for, I think there's still people who are my age back in different countries, even in classrooms, there'll be a cane or a stick for, you know, bad behavior. There's that influence an experience.
That was a big shift within 1 or 2 generations.
It really was, wasn't it? So then, you know, when they're parents, they haven't had that modelling before, or it might be something quite different, and telling your kids off or whatever that might be seems really quite natural. So when you are ignoring a behaviour, I'd love just to go through that a little bit more, because I feel like that's a real challenge. How long do you ignore it for? Do you know what I mean?
Depends on how old the kid is, right?
Yeah.
Like,
so for this
little kids,
for this group of kids, what would you say? Like, how?
I would say, I mean, some kids are very stubborn, but I would say a few minutes.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
And the issue is, like, a lot of times part of my job was to coach parents. I usually use the word mom, not because I only work with moms, but that it does tend to be who shows up for these interventions more frequently. Like working with mom and dad, and to stay the course. A lot of times we talk about strategies for how they can distract themselves, their own distress tolerance. Like I love to work some of those tactics into my intervention work these days, so parents have their own skills to use while they're implementing the parenting skills. Because kids will, like, they know, they're very smart, and they have, you're breaking a behavior chain, right? Where they got in the pattern of doing this behavior that got mom and dad to really quickly jump to it, and we are saying, we need to change that. Because the extinction burst, it's the worst. There's this concept called the extinction burst, when you're trying to extinguish a behavior, where somebody, in this situation, a kid will actually increase the potency and frequency of the behavior, because, well, it usually works. Let's try it a little higher.
They're clever.
That's one of our training modules, is actually forewarning the parents like beware the extinction burst and stay the course.
I love that. I love that even just knowing about that, and to stay the course then makes more sense than to go, oh my gosh, it's not working. It's
like, of course. Like, we're just like, I do the same thing. If this worked, how many times do you try to like click a button like harder to get your computer to do something? Like,
and is within that context as well, timeout was a really big thing that was talked about not that long ago, and timeout is not something that we talk about a lot anymore. Does that fit into this intervention in terms of how it works?
Yeah, that is the discipline strategy of choice in parent-child interaction therapy. It's one of them, is timeout. It is a very specific timeout procedure. It is not, timeout can be pretty controversial in the research. I try to stay, I've read a lot about the forthcoming research on it. And what seems to be the crux of it from my purview is that timeout administered consistently and effectively and, dispassionately, is an effective strategy to support kids behaving in helpful ways. Timeouts enacted in anger with inconsistency, with parents being really dysregulated, are actually can be harmful and problematic. So in PCIT, we do a lot of work to train timeout. There's a specific procedure. If kids don't listen to once we've moved from the positive free play part of the intervention, we move into a more directive part. And if it seems a little bit silly, but we basically have kids practice complying with certain instructions. And if they don't comply, again, these are kids with behavioral problems, we practice a timeout procedure and we coach the parent right through it.
Wow.
That is so good because like my children are 8 and 4, but just some things that I've been given as advice, and it's just 1 or 2 lines, but I carry it through me, and some of those things I utilize almost every day, and it's that individualized coaching. And although to you as the clinician, it might just be a sentence that you say, in one of your intervention sessions, it can have such a carry-on effect. Things like not engaging in timeout, I remember hearing that quite young in terms of not putting that anger back into it, because obviously then it takes away from what is happening in timeout.
Anger's reinforcing. That's a reaction.
Yeah.
That is reinforcing the child's misbehavior, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I love...
You would think, right? Oh, my kid doesn't want to see me angry. Kids really, really love attention. So that's why timeout is at the second phase of treatment. We start with reinforcing kids with positive relationship building activities. So they're getting all of that from their relationship. And then what the behaviors that endure, that are problematic or dangerous or unhelpful, we practice timeout with.
Wow. And again, this just reinforces how beautiful a telehealth intervention is for this. It's so lovely, because if you had that kind of support within the household, you're engaged, you're motivated, you want to be there. So to have someone to be able to talk you through that as it's happening is so beautifully encouraging for the parent.
It's so wonderful. And even like, this is a very structured intervention I'm talking to you about. I've also done less structured, but I'll pull from the skills, right? My favorite kind of interventions are actually working in primary care, where I do like 2 or 3 sessions as like a tune-up with families who aren't maybe needing tons of support, but they need just a couple of strategies. And like, we can use, instead of, arbitrarily using the timeout chair in the therapist's office at the doctor's office, we use the chair that the kid's going to use at their house.
That's right.
Like we locate the timeout place together, and then we go and we take the parent to the next room, and I keep them company while they're tolerating their kid's first timeout, which is really, really sucks. Really sucks.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
But that's when you're going to have a big impact.
Yeah, that's right.
That's when they
when I can tell you, hey,
this
really sucks.
Yeah. No, that's lovely. Gosh, thank you for going through that with us. I think that's just so incredibly valuable. And I can see you're very, very passionate about it. So that's great. And now I guess, you've gone through the results in some just briefly, but let's go through the results in a little bit more detail, but the things that really stood out to you. What would you say are the things that you really took away from this research study?
So there are a couple key points that I keep coming back to, which is, thing number 1 is that we talk so much about how stress is terrible and it results in all of these bad outcomes. And I think it can be somewhat discouraging to families, because we're basically telling them all the stress, a lot of times, which is completely outside of the family's control, is bad for their kids' health.
Yeah.
that's a bummer.
Really demoralizing, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
My boss like always says, this is the bad news. But the take home here is that parents have this remarkable capacity to protect their children from the stress that they may lack control over.
Yeah.
So if parents are able to intentionally, we think that one of the reasons parents in this specific study were emitting these improved behaviors is because of the intervention. But, if parents are intentionally able to increase their positive parenting skills and decrease their negative ones, that may have a stress buffering effect on their kids that is evident in their children's cells.
Wow. And that is
like, how cool is that?
Beautiful. It is. It really is. And that actually is really empowering, isn't it?
Yes. And the coolest thing about this study is this was a study of stressed families. Like, the incomes that these families on average reported and they were living in such an expensive area. They were really coping with a lot of financial stress. What we found is that in the families exposed to these effects were significant in the families exposed to the most stress. Yeah. So that suggests that even in the face of a ton of stress, parents have this remarkable capacity to protect their children. These were not just the parents who were dealing with a couple stressors. These are parents who are coping with a lot.
Yeah.
I really think we should prevent this stress exposure. I think it's unfair, and I think there's a lot of work we can do to actually prevent stress exposure.
Absolutely.
But I also think we got to hand it to these families that manage to work so hard to increase these skills to protect their kids.
That is just beautiful.
What an amazing thing to provide. It's just, and it's in those early ages, we know the importance of early intervention and impacting kids while they're young. And if you can empower those parents.
It accumulates over time. This is a biological signal, and this is a psychological to biological signal, which is already statistically, it's hard to find these. And we found this in 3 to 4.5-year-olds.
Incredible.
Imagine really what's going to happen for these families as these processes interact down the road.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now we kind of touched on it because we know that this study focused on children with a lower socioeconomic background, but how generalizable are these findings to children without developmental delays or from different socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds?
Yeah, so I've thought about this a little bit, and the thing that we want to make sure that we are doing is that we're studying parenting in a way that is culturally relevant. The way that we measure parenting was effective for these families, but that is also something that parenting research is taking a bit of a reckoning on. Are we measuring parenting behaviors in a way that not only is culturally, we change to adapt to what is a positive or negative behavior in different cultures, but maybe we're also not even getting all the strength that different families use, because parenting looks different culture to culture. Some cultures are more likely to use physical touches for praise. Some are more likely to use certain types of phrasing for praise. Parenting is very diverse. It's as diverse as the people who are doing the parenting. So if our measure is not sensitive to that diversity, we will miss our ability to detect that signal. That is all to say that I think if we modulate our parenting behaviors and how we are supporting parents in a way that is culturally sensitive and thoughtful, I do think that these effects generalize. There's research showing aspects of these findings in different and broad and diverse groups of individuals. What we do seem to find, though, is that buffering effects, there seems to be, we just wrote a review on about many different biomarkers sensitive to stress exposure. And one of the themes that emerged from the review is that we see the biggest changes in the kids who are coping with the most stress. So it seems to be that this is generalizable, but I would hypothesize we see the most bang for our buck in families that are coping with more stress.
You're going to have the most impact. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to come, and I can already think of things where you might, and you kind of indicated to where to from here, and things that you're looking into. But what is, and you mentioned obviously research is something you're very passionate about, and this study only leads to many more things. So where to from here? What are you looking into?
Well, I am thrilled to be at UCSF, which is this interdisciplinary research hub. So I'm in this beautiful building where we've got psychologists, we've got psychiatrists. My mentor has connected me with the opportunity to go and talk to the people who made up this clock.
Great.
So that I'm excited to do more of that, to get more training so that I can be a better interdisciplinary scientist. I certainly don't want to be an expert. I'm in all of these things. I want to be a psychologist who can talk to people. Right now, I'm trying to get some training in inflammatory markers, and I'm also trying to get some training in intergenerational transmission. So might there be a 2-gen effect of parenting interventions?
Wow.
And you can pull all of that
Yes, that's some of the research we do.
That's really brilliant.
So not only does it help, we know dyadic interventions, parent-child interventions help kids. What about interventions administered prenatally? Might we see an effect not only on maternal health, but also her children's health after birth, due to both processes of stress exposure and also improvement in maternal parenting and caregiving practices because she's doing better? So that's where some of my research is trying to go.
That's huge. And I mean, we're looking at each other because, a lot of our families that we might encounter and see in our services often have really traumatic experiences when they first have their baby, and the stresses that are associated with that, and being in hospital for as long as they need to be, and so many appointments. We can tell that there would be an effect, but we can't quantify that yet. We don't really truly know that. But this has got us really thinking about it, and we can't wait for you to do more research here. So
we'll be talking to you again.
I also just want to recommend, if anyone's curious, I'm part of the intergenerational developmental health program, and this is a whole portfolio of research on these dyadic interventions, as well as these 2-gen interventions. And if folks are curious, I really recommend they go to devhealth.ucsf.edu, devhealth.ucsf.edu, where we have lay summaries, links to all of our research.
That's really great. And we'll pop them on our website as well. So
I'm going to check that out.
Can have a check at
it's decades of science that all seems to point to whole family health is how we help kids.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's really beautiful. Well, look, before we wrap all of this up, of course, we do need to go to our final segment, and we're curious to see what kind of question he comes up with this one. So let's go into the next segment that's called Tell It to Ed. Ed, as you know, is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening, taking notes, and I'm pretty sure he's probably noted a lot of stuff he said about machine learning. Is it a question about that? I'm not entirely sure. Let's see. All right, so before we get to him, Alexandra, I'll get you to summarize this research in about 60 seconds or so, and Ed will have time for one question. Take it away, Alexandra.
So this was a study where we wanted to see if changes or improvements in parenting practices might be able to protect children from the negative biological consequences of adversity exposure. And so we were able to look at this in a subgroup of kids who participated in an internet-based, evidence-based parenting intervention, a small group of 62 kids. And what we found is that in the families exposed to the most stress, improvements in parenting, so increases in positive parenting, and decreases in negative parenting actually disrupted or protected kids from the association between stress and accelerated biological aging. So said more simply, is that when families who are coping with stress are able to improve their parenting practices, their children seem to show biological indicators of improved health. And the biggest take-home message that I think is important here is that this suggests that while we know stress is really problematic and harmful and can be harmful to kids' health, parents have an incredible restorative and health-promoting and protective capacity for their kids.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's really, really lovely. Thank you. Great summary. All right, over to you, Ed, for your question.
I've enjoyed this conversation. It's been great learning about this whole aging thing and the biological age stuff. And I love listening to these episodes, and I think the viewers don't quite understand that when I'm listening to the episode, most of the questions that I have in my head already get asked by the host, so I have to kind of be a little bit creative sometimes.
Sorry.
The low-hanging fruit for someone like myself kind of disappears early on. I guess my initial question that I was going to ask, and it almost didn't get asked, was about how this translates to children without developmental delays.
Sorry.
So I am going to go down the machine learning route because it's kind of the easiest question for a tech-minded person like myself to ask.
Sorry, he does machine learning. All right, well, let's see.
I'll try it out.
Okay, give it a go. Give it a go.
Okay, so I know that you covered how the algorithms kind of were based on like an adult data set and then a child or a young adult's data set. And I'm wondering how the algorithm would have been customized or trained on data for children with developmental delays and whether that was a specific subset or, yeah, it kind of ties in, I guess, a little bit with how translatable it is between children who don't have that and children who do and how the algorithm kind of accounted for that.
That's a really good question. Take it away.
So this, and I can also give you guys a citation if you're curious at the end of the episode for the pediatric buccal epigenetic clock. So this is the clock that is best for kids, and how this data set was created, this massive data set upon which the algorithm was trained, was a huge collaboration between many different studies. So this wasn't one study who collected one cohort. If you look at the author list for this study, there are dozens of very established, excellent scientists who contributed their cohort data to this clock. And I do know that this is a great question because I think we need more research on individuals with developmental delay. We certainly had neuroatypical kids in this sample. There were children with autism spectrum disorders, but I would imagine that there was a relatively, I would hypothesize if we were to ask all these kids and test whether or not they evidenced developmental delay, there was certainly some representation in the data set because developmental delays are incredibly common and increasingly more common. And often just like early intervention seems to really like support kids who have developmental delays. So I would say that this data set is the best poised to track the question that we have asked right now.
Yes.
But I think that more research, particularly with attention to increasing the diversity, especially the neurotypicality of the children in the data set, would improve the translatability.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love that. And I think what we've combined here today and what you've done, I mean, we haven't done any of this, we just asked you. And it's to combine an intervention with modern technology of how we can actually move forward and answer these big questions. So, and I love that it's so multidisciplinary, right? We're bringing in people from all different disciplines to be able to answer these questions. And like, how incredibly cool is that? So, yeah. Well, congratulations on all this work, Alexandra. And thank you for joining us today. I can't quite tell what time it is there, so we probably should wrap up. It's probably nighttime there. So, but thank you for listening, and please do send through those links. We'll put them all on our website, ResearchWorks.net. So please head there if you want links to this paper and also to the website that Alexandra spoke about today as well. There's a CPD form there that you can fill out as well if you want to keep this as part of a record of your PD requirements. But for now, we should say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so
hey?
much. Learned so much from you and inspired by what you're going to continue to do. So look forward to hearing from you again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, to all of our listeners, we'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.